Welcome to another episode of the North Carolina Tar Heels Insider Podcast. I'm your host, Logan Lazarchik, beat writer for North Carolina Tar Heels on SI. Today with another episode, which we will be focusing on North Carolina's current standing in the ACC heading into next season. But before we get started, just want to thank you guys for tuning in, for listening, and you can catch this podcast on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, and everywhere where you get your podcast. But without further ado, let's start with today's topic, which we will be previewing the ACC standings in 2026-27 college basketball season. North Carolina last season finished fourth in the conference at 24-9 and 12-6 in the conference. Not the best season based on their expectations. They want to challenge for the conference every single season in the regular season and in the conference tournament. And in the conference tournament, they lost, and they had a double bye, but they lost in their first game to Clemson. Caleb Wilson's absence was definitely apparent in that game as North Carolina's offense just looked in flux and disorganized and discombobulated. And this season, there are more expectations for North Carolina. The talent may not be where it was last year. Like I said, the last couple of days, they're losing Caleb Wilson, Henry Vasar. Wilson's going to be a top 3, top 4 pick in the upcoming NBA draft. But considering, the circumstances of this offseason, making a coaching change, hiring a coach and Michael Malone less than 24 hours before the transfer portal opened, they did a very good job of accumulating talent, filling out a roster that could compete. But let's start with, the ACC. We're going to start with what we've seen so far this offseason in the transfer portal, not just from North Carolina's perspective, but from around the conference. And, Duke and Louisville, those are two teams, that really stood out. And last year, Duke ran away with the ACC, 35-3 overall record, 17-1 in the conference, with their lone loss coming to North Carolina at the Dean E. Smith Center from a buzzer-beating shot from Seth Trimble with 0.1 seconds remaining, the only lead that North Carolina had in that game. And then Virginia finished in second, and then Miami was in third, North Carolina fourth, Clemson fifth, and Louisville sixth. I think we're going to see a shakeup at the top of this conference, and I think this is going to be a top-heavy conference next season. But I think Duke has to be considered the favorite in this conference once again. For the third time in 4 years, they have the number 1 recruiting class under Sean Shire. And then they retained multiple of their players. They retained a Caden Boozer. They retained a Dame Sarr. They retained Patrick Ngongba. They retained Caleb Foster. And then you bring in John Blackwell through the transfer portal from Wisconsin. He averaged, 20 points per game there. You get Cam Williams, who's a 5-star recruit, and they also have, 2 5-star recruits and 2 4-star recruits on their bench to add to Caleb Foster, which, that's arguably a starting lineup at various spots in college basketball. So Duke's lineup, coaching, you have to consider them the favorite by far in this conference. And, of course, they're one of the title favorites to win the whole thing next year in March and cut down the nets. So I think North Carolina, they're going to try their best to compete. I think, as I said last season, better roster, better talent. I think a deeper roster, more depth. They're still trying to fill out that front court. Mike Malone is still recruiting overseas, still contacting players around other conferences, which I'll have a article posted later today about that, of who they're talking to. But I think it's going to come down to coaching for North Carolina if they can compete with Duke, keep up with the Blue Devils. And I do think they have, North Carolina has the talent on the roster. It's just, first-time head coach, pulling all these pieces together, trying to gel everything together, on the fly, really. I think you may see some growing pains in North Carolina. We'll talk about them here shortly. But I do think it's going to have to be a coaching masterclass this year from Michael Malone if the Tar Heels want to win the conference. But the second team I think is going to pose the most issues for the Tar Heels challenging for the ACC in the regular season and in the conference tournament later down the line is the Louisville Cardinals. The Cardinals, they spent nearly 20 million in NIL money to really. I mean, they have one of the most stacked rosters in the country. They signed Jack Shellstat out of Oregon. They got Carter Knox from Arkansas. Flory Badunga from Kansas was probably a top 2, top 3 player in the portal. They were able to land him. They got Alvaro Fogueres from Iowa, an underrated transfer portal acquisition, and then Gabe Dines, center from USC, another transfer they got. And then on top of all that, they were able to get Obina Okezi Jr. He was a 5-star recruit in 2027, reclassified to 2026. And he's going to complement Badunga very well. Badunga will be your, prototypical center rim protector. Okezi Jr. is really a player that can operate at all 3 levels. He can shoot the ball. He can pass. He can also be another rim protector. The number 2 overall player in next year's class, but now he will be playing at Arizona under Pat Kelsey at Louisville this upcoming season. And then they were also able to retain Adrian Woolley. So there's a lot of competition in this conference, especially at the top. I do think you'll see somewhat of a drop-off from Virginia and Miami. Both those teams finished above North Carolina last season in the conference standings. Virginia retained most of their roster, didn't really make a huge addition through the portal or the recruitment pool, and Miami lost several players. They also brought in a couple of interesting players from the portal, but I think those 2 teams will be the ones that you see fall off the most. I don't think that, it's not going to be a fall, to 10th or 11th in standings, but I don't expect Virginia to be in second place in this conference, and I don't expect Miami to, they finished, if I'm looking here, they finished 3rd in the conference. So 2 and 3, North Carolina, I think they lost to, or they beat Virginia last season. They had to come back, and they lost to Miami last year. That was actually the game in which Caleb Wilson suffered the first of one of his hand injuries. That one was not season-ending, but it culminated into his thumb injury at practice late in the season. But I do think North Carolina, next season's success is going to come down to coaching. As I've said, I do think that they have pieces on this roster that could elevate them. And I do think they're going to have a better overall outcome of the season. 24-9 and 12-6 with what they had at their disposal last season is a major disappointment. I mean, they were North Carolina, not just in terms of the talent starting lineup, but just depth in general. They played 8-9 deep, which is, in the NIL, it's kind of an unforeseen thing, unorthodox thing to see because there's so many players going to different, programs and all that the depth is very weak. A lot of rosters you'll see are loaded at the top with, elite talent, but they don't really fill out depth-wise. And North Carolina had that, and I think that's kind of what separated them from a lot of teams was just their depth, but, they weren't able to take advantage of that. Hubert Davis wasn't really able to take advantage of that. And this year I do think Michael Malone, although he doesn't have the depth that Hubert Davis had, I do expect more from Michael Malone next season in Chapel Hill. I think he's obviously an upgraded coach to what they had last season. And North Carolina, what I'm hoping for is that they are, you're going to see those growing pains in the beginning of the year. But if they can get through those and mold those a little bit during the non-conference schedule prior to the start of conference play, I do think they have a chance to I think we have to set expectations for the Tar Heels next season. I don't think they're going to compete to win the regular season title. I view their ceiling in this conference based on the rosters and the coaches in this conference, probably right around where they were last year, probably 3rd or 4th. I do think the product on the court will be a tad better because I do think the shooting will be better. Schematically, they'll be better. Offensive sets will be more cohesive. And I just think 3rd or 4th place is probably their ceiling. I do expect them to be better than 24-9. But I don't know how many games Duke and Louisville are going to lose. I mean, combined, maybe on one hand, that they may lose like 5 games combined next year. That's how good and deep their rosters are. And like I said, NIL, it kind of thins out rosters, but those 2 teams were able to spend a bunch of money. And I think Duke, Louisville, and Tennessee, I believe, were the 3 highest spending teams in the portal. Tennessee added a lot of talent, their SEC team, so they don't really have to do much with this conversation. But I think just when you look at in the terms of programs that spent the most money, programs that were aggressive, those three teams definitely spent more than any other team. In North Carolina, they definitely had to spend, a pretty penny to get some of these players, but definitely not up to that price tag that these other programs pay. So Duke and Louisville, I think next year, if you had to put in the tiers, those two are in the tier of their own at the top. North Carolina, Virginia, potentially Miami. I think those are your second tier teams. And I think those 4 or 5 teams, you'll kind of see a jumble of those 5 teams at the top. But if I had to guess right now, based on pedigree and based on who I trust the most, I probably have Duke at 1. I think Jon Scheyer's done a great job of, not just, assembling talent and accumulating players, highly ranked in the recruitment pool and transfer portal, but he also has shown that he is an excellent coach. He's won the most games, in a very short span in the program history. And Duke, I think, is in a position to challenge for a national title once again. The last 2 years, they've really kind of choked those opportunities. They probably should have been, the championship game 2 years ago with Cooper Flag, and then this past year they're in the Elite Eight and they choked that game against UConn. So you can make an argument that they should have been back-to-back Final Four appearances, potentially, back-to-back finals appearances, and who knows, maybe they are back-to-back champions. So Duke for me is number 1. Louisville is number 2 solely on talent. I do think Pat Kelsey's also another really good coach, but I do give the edge to Jon Scheyer. But Louisville definitely went all out to ensure that they will not finish in 6th place in the ACC like they did last season. And they had a really good roster last season, and their main weakness was that front court, and they definitely, they got that in abundance now. So Louisville's 2, and I think North Carolina, I think what's going to hold them back, I think they're going to be in 3rd. I really trust Michael Malone, his experience in the NBA. I think their biggest issues in this conference are going to be coaching. I don't want to say you'll be like at a total disadvantage, but it is Michael Malone's first year in college basketball, coaching North Carolina, a lot of pressure coming in. Jon Scheyer's been experienced. He played at Duke. He knows, the culture and all of what comes with coaching with the Blue Devils. And so I think coaching 1, and then front court, that's where North Carolina's going to, I think, have their most issues against, Duke and Louisville in particular. Sayan Keita, 5-star recruit from overseas, he'll be the starter. It'll be interesting to see how he translates his game to the NCAA. And then Cade Betterman, I think he's a great depth piece. But right now, North Carolina's front court depth, specifically the center position, is a bit thin. And I think that could be exposed there. You have Nicholas Abdalas and Matt Abel, who both have ACC experience. So I think that will serve them well when they're playing these top-tier teams in the conference. But this is a team with, it's a lot of moving parts put together. Like I said, Duke, 4 of their players from last season's roster is still there. 3 of them will most likely be in the starting lineup. And so they already have that chemistry. North Carolina, new coach, a lot of moving parts in the roster. I do think Terrence Brown playing the Big 12, I think it's a huge help for him because the Big 12 is obviously a better conference, better competition than the ACC. So I think that will help. And Jaren Stevenson, returning senior, 2nd season in Chapel Hill, I think that will also help a lot. But for me, biggest issues for North Carolina and challenging for this conference is the front court depth, and then just, a learning experience at coaching with Michael Malone. Even though he's very experienced, winning at the highest level, it is a different type of atmosphere and style of game in college. But I do think he will implement most of his, schematics and offensive sets that he had in the NBA to North Carolina. But yeah, I think North Carolina ceiling for next year in the ACC, I would say it's 3rd place. I wouldn't be surprised if they finished in 4th, but I do expect them to have another double bye in the conference tournament. I expect them to be more consistent on both sides of the ball. I don't expect them to lose as many games. They had 9 losses last year, like I said, 12-6 in the conference. I do expect that to improve as well, because not just because that I think Michael Malone is that big of an upgrade at coaching, but also because I think you will see other programs in the conference kind of take a step back. North Carolina State lost Will Wade, head coach, kind of surprisingly, he left for LSU. And then, teams like SMU are going to lose a lot of talent. So those lower tier teams that kind of gave North Carolina issues last year, I also think will slip. So North Carolina, it's off season. We're still, months away from the regular season. So there's a lot that can happen, a lot of, change, a lot of chemistry being built through these next months. So I don't want to just be dismissive of North Carolina, but I do think that we have to set realistic expectations for them. And so for that reason, I have them finishing, third, fourth, somewhere along those lines in the conference. That will do it for our episode today. Make sure to tune in tomorrow. I'll have another episode about more news and updates around North Carolina. But again, thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.